My religious parents kicked me out for being pregnant. Now they want to move in and be active grandparents. I was 17 when I first realized something was wrong, when I missed my period and spent a whole week in denial, brushing off the calendar on my phone that clearly showed I was overdue. My parents, devout evangelical Christians, always believed that any physical intimacy before marriage was a grave sin, and they never missed an opportunity to preach about purity and chastity. Growing up, I heard more sermons in my living room than I ever did in church. My father would read from the Bible daily and emphasize how we must remain clean in God's eyes, while my mother would nod sternly, glancing over at me to make sure I was taking it all in. The unspoken message was always the same. Sex is for married couples, and if you break that rule, you shame your entire family and turn your back on the Lord. I tried to be the good daughter. I really did. For most of my teenage years, I followed the script they'd laid out for me, going to youth group meetings, wearing modest clothes, avoiding anything they considered worldly. But the summer before my senior year of high school, I started dating this boy, Eric, who was gentle and supportive in a way that felt different from the heavily rule-bound environment I was used to. He wasn't religious, though he was respectful about my parents' beliefs when he came by the house. We would do things like sit on the porch swing and talk about the future, or watch movies on the couch with a foot of space between us, because my parents insisted that any closer was tempting fate. I kept telling myself we were just holding hands, just kissing a little, that nothing serious was happening. But as the months passed and our feelings grew, the closeness eventually escalated. The night it happened, I remember feeling torn between guilt and excitement, that flush of rebellious energy coursing through me. It wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't something I did lightly. Part of me had this constant reel of my parents' disapproval running in the back of my mind, warning me I'd be condemning myself. But the part of me that craved normal teenage experiences, that longed to feel love in a genuine physical way, overshadowed everything else. Afterward, I was racked with shame, certain that I had ruined any chance of God loving me, or so my parents would have me believe. In the weeks that followed, I kept telling myself it was just a one-time mistake. I promised myself we'd go back to kissing and holding hands, that we wouldn't do it again until we were older, or maybe married. But then I missed my period, and another week went by, then another. I was never irregular, so I grew increasingly panicked. My parents didn't notice my mood at first, too consumed by their church obligations and their usual zeal for what they called saving souls. It wasn't until I snuck out to buy a pregnancy test at the local pharmacy that it fully hit me. My entire life might be about to change in a way I couldn't control. It was a Saturday morning when I locked myself in the bathroom with that test. Eric was at his part-time job, and my parents had gone to some church event. I can still recall the pattern of the tile, the hum of the overhead fan, the smell of bleach from my mom's recent cleaning spree. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the test still. The result showed up in less than a minute, a bold pink line that left zero room for doubt. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, staring at the test until my vision blurred. I think I sat there for half an hour, crying so quietly I could barely hear myself. I wish I could say I had some immediate sense of maternal joy or a clarity of purpose, but mostly I was terrified. I knew how my parents would react. They'd see me not just as a disappointment, but a walking reminder of sin, a child of theirs who dared to break God's law. I also knew Eric would be worried. We were just kids, finishing high school, with no savings, no plan for this. My mind spun scenarios of shame and condemnation, but in none of those scenarios did I see a positive outcome with my family. Still, I felt like I had to tell them. Keeping it a secret wouldn't be possible for long, and I wanted them to hear it from me, rather than from rumors or a swelling belly. I rehearsed the conversation in the mirror for 2 days before I finally mustered the courage. By then, I'd only told Eric, who was shocked, but said he'd stand by me no matter what. He offered to come with me to break the news to my parents, but I said no. I felt like I needed to do it alone. Maybe I was hoping to appeal to their parental instincts, to show them I was scared and needed their guidance. So on a Tuesday evening, I joined them at the dinner table. My mother was discussing a church fundraiser. My father was reading a religious magazine. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. Finally, I set my fork down, took a breath, and told them I was pregnant. The silence that followed was like a vacuum. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide, as if I'd just said I'd murdered someone. My father slowly lowered his magazine, looking at me like I was some stranger who just barged in, not the daughter he'd raised. His face went pale and his jaw tightened. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Then he asked in a voice that was all too calm, "How far along?" When I told him I thought it was about 8 weeks, he closed his eyes as though in prayer. But when he opened them, there was only fury. He hurled verses at me, the same ones I'd heard all my life, about fornication, about the wages of sin, about how I had ruined my purity and broken his trust. My mother broke down, sobbing hysterically, wailing about how she couldn't face the church community anymore, how everyone would know her daughter was a harlot. I tried to explain it was just one mistake, that Eric and I wanted to figure things out, that we weren't going to do anything rash like run away together. But the moment I mentioned Eric's name, my dad slammed his hand on the table, sending his water glass toppling over. He told me I was no daughter of his anymore. He said I had disrespected not just our family, but God himself, and that my presence under his roof was an abomination. My mother kept pleading with him to calm down, but even she didn't defend me. I saw in her eyes a crippling fear, a willingness to accept his wrath as something she had to endure. She asked if maybe there was a solution. She avoided the word abortion, but implied it with trembling lips. My father seized on that suggestion, turning his anger toward her. "We will not add murder to this family's sins," he shouted, and she whimpered an apology. I sat there, stunned, tears streaming down my face, realizing I was truly alone. He told me to pack a bag and get out. I felt a swirl of betrayal. Was this really happening? Was I so disposable that my own parents would cast me aside like this? I tried to reach for my mother's hand, but she pulled back as if my touch burned. I felt numb, gathering my clothes, stuffing them into a duffel bag. My entire life was in that house childhood photos, stuffed animals, diaries, all left behind because I was too crushed to even think about them. When I lugged my bag down the stairs, my father was waiting by the door, arms crossed, Bible in hand. He didn't speak. My mother stood behind him, tears on her cheeks, but she didn't speak either. I left quietly, stepping out into the chilly night air, feeling more alone than I ever thought possible. Eric's family wasn't particularly well off, but when I called him near hysterical, he insisted I come stay with them for a while. They lived in a small, cluttered apartment on the other side of town. His dad was out of the picture, his mom worked 2 jobs, and Eric had a younger sister who was still in middle school. That first night, Eric gave me his bed while he slept on the couch. I spent the entire night crying, trying to piece together how my parents' love could be so conditional. Over the next few weeks, Eric's mom helped me navigate the practicalities, doctor's appointments, insurance details, even applying for some state assistance. She didn't have a lot, but she tried to make room for me in their cramped living space. We had to share a bathroom, and the living room became a makeshift bedroom for Eric. Still, it was more warmth and acceptance than I'd ever felt in my own home. She never once scolded me or lectured me. Instead, she showed me kindness, offering me cups of tea, rubbing my back when morning sickness hit, telling me that no matter what happened, I wasn't alone. Eventually, I tried contacting my mother by phone, leaving messages that went unanswered. I wrote letters, tear-stained and desperate, promising that I still loved them, that I needed them. Nothing came back. It was like they'd vanished, or maybe they just blocked me out. I heard from a family friend that my parents had told the church congregation that I ran away to live in sin. They framed it like I had chosen to leave, that I was a rebellious daughter who abandoned them and turned my back on faith. It hurt more than I could describe, but I didn't have the energy to fight their narrative. Despite the emotional turmoil, life went on in practical ways. I still had to finish high school. I walked the halls with a growing belly, enduring stares and whispers. Some people were supportive teachers who offered me extra help, classmates who told me they admired my courage. Others were judgmental, giving me side eyes as if I were contagious. Eric was there as much as he could be, but he also had to keep up with school and his part-time job, saving every penny in case we needed it for the baby. We graduated that May. My parents didn't show up to the ceremony. Eric and I walked across the stage to receive our diplomas, and I wore a billowy gown that barely hid the bump. I remember feeling a strange sense of triumph. I made it, even though my parents had tried to cast me aside like some embarrassment. A part of me wanted to stand on stage and shout, "I'm still here. I'm still worthy of happiness." But I settled for hugging Eric and Eric's mom, who cried and took pictures like the proud parent she was trying to be. By the time I was 8 months pregnant, it was obvious we needed our own space. Eric's mom was gracious, but the apartment was too cramped, and I couldn't keep sleeping in Eric's room while he crashed on the couch. We found a small one-bedroom unit in a not great neighborhood, but the rent was manageable for two newly graduated teenagers with part-time gigs. I worked in a grocery store, mostly behind a register, but eventually my belly got so big that standing for hours became painful. I took my maternity leave early, which meant I had no choice but to ration my savings carefully. The birth itself was a whirlwind. We had a baby girl, Mia, named after Eric's grandmother. We were both scared out of our minds in the delivery room. There was a complication when my blood pressure spiked, and for a moment, the doctors were worried about preeclampsia. But eventually, after hours of contractions and tears and sheer determination, Mia arrived, screaming her little lungs out. Eric cried openly, holding her in his arms, promising to protect and love her forever. I held her, my entire body shaking from exhaustion, tears of relief streaming down my face. In that moment, I realized that as terrifying as this was, I had someone who needed me unconditionally, and I wanted to be the kind of mother who would never abandon her child. Eric's mom visited the hospital, bringing a small teddy bear and some flowers. She'd never had a grandchild before, and I could tell she was over the moon. Meanwhile, I kept staring at the door, half expecting my own parents to burst in, having changed their minds. But they never came. My mother didn't call. My father didn't send a letter. I was on my own. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights, feedings, diaper changes, and trying to figure out how to be parents when we were barely adults ourselves. Eric took a night shift at a warehouse so we could stagger our schedules. He'd watch Mia during the day while I picked up shifts at the grocery store. Then I'd watch her at night while he worked. It was grueling. We were exhausted, stressed about money, stressed about our future. Still, our tiny apartment felt more like a home than my parents' house ever did. I would sometimes sit on the couch, holding Mia, and wonder if my parents even thought about her. Did they realize they had a granddaughter? Did they care? One day, out of the blue, I got a call from a familiar number. My heart lurched. It was my mom. Her voice was shaky, but polite. She asked how I was doing, and after a moment, she asked if I'd gotten rid of that baby. The question stunned me. I told her in a trembling voice that I had a daughter, healthy and perfect, that she was a few months old now. My mother went silent, then stammered something about how this kind of sin would follow me forever. I bit back tears and told her that Mia was no sin, that she was an innocent baby who deserved love. My mother didn't quite respond. She just said that she was praying for me, then hung up. I stared at the phone, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. Time marched on. Mia grew from a newborn to an inquisitive baby, crawling around the living room, babbling nonsense that made us laugh. We were still scraping by, but we made it work. We even started talking about the possibility of college classes, maybe an online program for me so I could keep an eye on Mia. Every so often, I'd think about writing another letter to my parents, but I couldn't handle the rejection anymore. Their absence felt like a deep wound that refused to heal. When Mia was about 1.5 years old, Eric and I scraped together enough money for a small wedding at the local courthouse. It wasn't fancy, just me in a simple white dress I'd found on clearance and him in a borrowed suit. We had a couple of close friends there as witnesses, along with Eric's mom and sister. Mia wore a tiny frilly dress. She toddled around, clapping her hands. Part of me was sad that my parents weren't there. I wasn't even sure if they knew I was getting married. I still clung to this tiny sliver of hope that they'd come around, that they'd realize I wasn't ruined or worthless. After we said our vows, we took a few pictures outside the courthouse. Then we all went to a diner for a celebration meal. It wasn't the dream wedding I'd once imagined, but it was ours, and it was filled with genuine love. I remember looking at Eric as he held Mia in his arms, smiling from ear to ear and feeling a sense of peace wash over me. Despite everything, I had a family, a real one, built on acceptance rather than condemnation. Fast forward another couple of years. Mia was nearly 4, a whirlwind of giggles and endless questions. Eric had managed to get a better job working as a junior technician at a local software company, slowly climbing up from the warehouse job. Meanwhile, I'd enrolled part-time in a community college program for early childhood education. It suited me. Maybe it was because of Mia that I found such passion in understanding how children learn and grow. We moved into a slightly bigger apartment, still modest, but it had a tiny second bedroom for Mia. I was content, although sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by dreams of my parents. In those dreams, they'd be standing at the foot of my bed, quoting the Bible, telling me I was eternally damned. Then I'd see Mia playing at their feet, and my father would scowl and say, "We don't want you here." I'd wake up sweating, Eric's arm draped protectively over me, as if even in sleep he knew I needed comfort. I hadn't spoken to my parents in years, not since that phone call where my mother asked if I'd aborted my child. I heard from a distant cousin that they had moved to a smaller house near the church, downsizing after I left. Part of me wanted to show them how well we were doing, to prove that my life wasn't the tragedy they'd predicted. But I kept my distance, certain they'd never change. Then, on a rainy afternoon when Mia was almost 5, I got a letter in the mail, addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. I recognized the neat loops of her cursive and felt my stomach knot. I stood in the doorway of our apartment building, rain spattering the pavement behind me, and tore open the envelope. The letter said my parents were having financial troubles, something about my dad losing his job at the company he'd been with for decades, and some medical bills that had piled up because my mom had needed surgery on her knee. It was vaguely worded, but the gist was that they were in a difficult position. And my mother wrote, "I know we haven't seen each other in a long time, but we'd like to talk about living arrangements." Living arrangements? I read that part 3 times, not believing it. Were they asking to move in with me? Suddenly, I felt a swirl of anger, confusion, and a bizarre excitement that maybe this meant they wanted to reconnect. I hurried upstairs, letter in hand, where Eric was in the kitchen making lunch, while Mia doodled on the fridge with magnets. I handed him the letter and watched his expression darken as he read it. He looked at me, eyebrows raised, and said, "Are they serious?" We debated for hours about how to respond. Eric was furious at the idea that they'd kicked me out, abandoned me emotionally, and now were crawling back because they needed help. I understood his anger. Part of me felt it too, but another part of me saw this as an opportunity, maybe for them to finally meet Mia and realize how wonderful she was. Was it foolish for me to hope they'd changed? I wrote back, carefully choosing my words. I asked for more details about their situation, said I'd consider ways to help, but made it clear that my own family, Eric and Mia, came first. I also reminded them that Mia existed, that she was healthy and about to start kindergarten. I didn't want to hide my daughter, nor did I want them to pretend she wasn't real. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her tone was subdued, almost pleading. She said my father's company let him go, that they'd lost a big chunk of their retirement savings in some bad investments, and that medical bills for her knee replacement were overwhelming. They couldn't afford their mortgage anymore, and the church's charity funds were limited. She said they had nowhere else to turn. She also mentioned that my father was still reconciling himself to the idea of contacting me. I asked if he was sorry for kicking me out. She paused, then gave a weak, "He's under a lot of stress right now." I felt a surge of frustration. Was it so hard to say I'm sorry or to acknowledge the pain they caused? But I also knew that if they were truly desperate, maybe this was my chance to stand up for myself. So I told her that if they wanted to discuss potentially moving in, we'd have to have an in-person meeting first. My mother agreed, relief flooding her voice. We set a date for them to come over the following weekend. The days leading up to that visit were a tornado of anxiety. I cleaned the apartment top to bottom, as if any speck of dust would give them another reason to judge me. Eric asked if I was sure about letting them in, worried about the emotional toll it might take. I told him I needed to see them, to see if they'd changed at all. Mia was excited at the prospect of new visitors, though she didn't understand who they were. I tried explaining they were her grandparents, but she didn't really grasp it. After all, she'd never met them. When the day arrived, I was a ball of nerves. Eric took Mia to the park for a while so I could have a chance to speak to my parents alone. Right on time, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find them standing there, older than I remembered. My father's hair had gone mostly gray, and my mother leaned heavily on a cane, presumably because of her knee. My father held a small suitcase, which struck me as odd had they assumed they could move in immediately. They stepped inside, glancing around. My father barely looked at me, focusing on the surroundings as though taking inventory of my life. My mother's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of sadness. She tried to reach out for a hug, but I froze, not sure if I was ready for that physical closeness. I gestured for them to sit on the couch. I took the armchair across from them, folding my hands in my lap, trying to suppress the tremor in my voice. I asked them about their situation. My father explained in clipped tones that his company downsized and he was let go. He'd been trying to find another job but had no luck. They fell behind on bills and the mortgage lender was threatening foreclosure. My mother's surgery added thousands in medical expenses. He admitted they were struggling. I waited for an apology or any acknowledgement of what they'd done to me. None came. Instead, my father finally turned his gaze on me and said, "We need a place to stay. Your mother's health is fragile." I swallowed hard and said, "So you're basically homeless and hoping you can live here?" He nodded stiffly. I pressed on, "What about my daughter? You know I have a child, right? She's nearly 5. My mother nodded quickly, as if that would smooth things over. "Yes, we understand. We'd like to be grandparents if that's still possible." My stomach churned. Could they just decide that after ignoring her existence for 5 years? I told them bluntly that I was hurt by their actions, that they'd kicked me out when I needed them most, and now they wanted to move in as if nothing had happened. My father's jaw tightened. He said, "Your decisions left us no choice back then." A spark of anger flared in me. "My decisions? I was 17, and I made a mistake. You're the adults who disowned your daughter." My father opened his mouth to retort, but my mother grabbed his arm. She looked at me with watery eyes and said, "We're sorry." It was barely above a whisper, and it felt more like a forced admission than a heartfelt apology. But it was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from them. I could have ended it there, told them to leave, that I wanted nothing to do with them. Part of me screamed for that resolution. Let them fend for themselves, just like they forced me to. But another part of me, the part that had always yearned for my parents' acceptance, hesitated. I remembered being pregnant, alone in the cold night air, carrying my duffel bag. I remembered the heartbreak, the resentment, but also how it felt to be that desperate, that powerless. Did I want to become like them, turning my back on family just because they failed me? I sighed, rubbing my temples. "We don't have a spare room," I said. "It's a 2-bedroom apartment, one for Eric and me, one for Mia." My mother glanced around. "We could stay on the couch if necessary," she murmured. My father gave a curt nod, as if he was only half listening. He seemed more concerned with the fact that the living room had pictures of Mia on every wall, no sign of any religious iconography. I told them that if they were to stay here, it wouldn't be permanent. Eric and I were saving up for a better place eventually, but we couldn't afford to take care of them indefinitely. My father bristled. "We're not asking for handouts," he insisted. "I can find a job soon, I'm sure." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to say something cruel about his confidence, given that he'd been unemployed for a while. Instead, I laid out some ground rules. They had to respect our lifestyle. No preaching about how I'd sinned or how Mia was born out of wedlock. No attempts to convert Eric or scold him. And if they couldn't abide by that, they couldn't stay. They both nodded, though I could see the tension in my father's expression. My mother quietly asked if she could use the bathroom, and I pointed down the hallway. She limped away, leaning heavily on her cane. My father and I were left in awkward silence. Finally, I said, "You realize Eric and I are married now, right?" He nodded. "Your mother mentioned it?" I waited for him to say more, maybe something about how we'd done the right thing by getting married, but he just stared at the floor. When my mother returned, I stood up. "Eric and Mia will be back soon," I said. "I'll need to introduce you, if you're up for it." They exchanged glances and said yes, they wanted to meet Mia. My heart pounded again, this time with a mix of fear and hope. I dreaded the idea of them rejecting her somehow, but also a tiny part of me dared to dream that seeing her might soften their attitudes. Eric came home with Mia about 15 minutes later. Mia was chattering excitedly about the playground swings when she noticed two strangers in the living room. She clung to Eric's leg, peering at my parents curiously. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she knelt down, wincing from the pain in her knee, and tried to say hello. My father stood stiffly, managing a small nod in Mia's direction. Mia didn't speak. She was shy around new people, especially ones who exuded such tension. Eric kept his expression neutral. I introduced them, explaining to Mia, "These are Grandma and Grandpa." Mia blinked, then whispered, "Grandma, Grandpa?" She'd heard those words in stories and cartoons, but she'd never actually had grandparents in her life. My mother reached out, gently stroking Mia's hair. Mia frowned at first, but then let her do it. My father seemed almost afraid to approach. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Hello, Mia," in a voice that was more timid than I'd ever heard from him. For the next hour, we sat uncomfortably in the living room, with Eric perched protectively beside Mia, my parents on the couch, and me hovering near the kitchen. My mother tried to ask Mia questions, how old she was, what she liked to play with. Mia answered in short sentences, occasionally looking to Eric or me for reassurance. My father barely spoke. When I offered them water or snacks, my father would just nod. My mother would say a polite, "Thank you." Eventually, Eric took Mia to her room to watch a cartoon, giving the rest of us a chance to discuss logistics. My mother expressed gratitude for even considering letting them stay. My father said little, though he didn't argue with the arrangement. I told them we'd clear a corner of the living room for them, maybe put a small cot there, but that they'd have to live out of suitcases for a while. My mother nodded, tears in her eyes, mumbling apologies and thanks. It was so surreal. Here were the same people who had banished me for being pregnant, now desperate and vulnerable. We decided to give it a trial run for a week, just to see how we'd all cope under the same roof. If it worked, they could stay longer while they sorted out their finances and looked for a new place. My father mentioned that the bank was seizing their house soon, so time was of the essence. I couldn't help feeling a pang of pity. Despite my anger, I didn't want to see them homeless. So that's how it began. Over the next few days, they moved in little by little, bringing clothes and a few personal items. They sold or gave away most of their furniture stuff they couldn't afford to store. It was strange seeing them in the apartment every morning. My mother would often wake up early to pray, though I noticed she kept her voice low so as not to disturb us. My father tried looking for jobs online, but at his age and with the market the way it was, he wasn't getting many responses. I was wary, always bracing for some clash, especially regarding how we were raising Mia. Inevitably, tensions rose. One afternoon, Mia was jumping around the living room, playing a game where she pretended the floor was lava. She nearly bumped into my mother's knee, causing my mother to yelp in pain. My father scolded Mia sharply, telling her she needed to sit down and behave. Mia burst into tears, not used to being yelled at by a stranger. Eric intervened, telling my father he had no right to speak to Mia like that, and my father shot back that a child should respect her elders. Eric's face flushed with anger, and I had to step in, trying to de-escalate the situation. My father stormed off to the bedroom corner, muttering about how children need discipline. Eric scooped up Mia, reassuring her that she wasn't in trouble. My mother apologized for the incident, but it left a sour taste in the air. Another time, I caught my father lecturing Eric about how the man should be the spiritual head of the household, and how he hoped Eric would see the light and attend church. Eric tried to be polite, but he eventually lost his cool, telling my father that in this household, we all share responsibilities and that religion is a personal choice. My father got that steely glare again, the one I recognized from my childhood, but he didn't explode like he used to. Maybe he realized he had no leverage now. It was my apartment, after all. In quieter moments, though, my parents showed a gentler side. My mother sometimes asked if she could help with cooking or laundry, and I let her. She'd fold Mia's tiny shirts with a tenderness that broke my heart. She'd sit with Mia on the couch, reading picture books in a halting voice, occasionally stumbling over words. Mia would giggle at my mother's dramatics when reading about a princess or a talking animal. My father watched these scenes from the sidelines, occasionally smiling a little, though he seemed reluctant to fully participate. As the weeks wore on, it became clear this arrangement wasn't just a short-term fix. My father kept job hunting, but with the economy in a slump and his skill set fairly narrow, nothing was coming through. My mother's knee problem made it difficult for her to work anything but a sedentary job, and she was still recovering. I told them we had to sit down and discuss the future realistically. Eric and I weren't making enough to support 2 more adults indefinitely, especially since we had to think about Mia's upbringing, our own bills, and the possibility of saving for a better apartment. When we finally had that sit down, my father bristled. He didn't like discussing finances with his daughter. He still saw me as a child, I guess. But I laid out the numbers, showing them how much we paid in rent, groceries, utilities, and how much Eric and I earned. My father was forced to admit that they could only contribute a tiny bit from what savings they had left, and that would run out soon. We explored the option of applying for government assistance, but my father was stubbornly proud, saying he wouldn't take handouts from the government. I told him he might have to swallow that pride if he wanted to keep a roof over his head. My mother wept quietly, wringing her hands. There were days I asked myself why I was doing this. Why was I going to such lengths for people who'd shown me nothing but contempt when I needed them? The answer, I suppose, was complicated. Part of me still longed for parental validation, for a shred of the love I'd craved as a teenager. Part of me wanted to show them that I was better than they were. I wouldn't abandon my family, no matter how they treated me. And part of me genuinely felt sorry for them. They were old, they were in debt, and their religious community wasn't stepping up to help in any meaningful way. Mia, for her part, started warming up to them in small ways. She'd sit next to my mother while coloring, or she'd run up to my father and tug on his sleeve to show him a drawing she made. He'd give her a stiff nod, but over time, he started responding more softly, telling her that the drawing was very nice. Mia called them Grandma and Grandpa, just like in storybooks. Sometimes I'd watch them together and feel a lump in my throat, wishing this had happened differently, wishing they had been in her life from the start, offering support instead of judgment. The final straw came one Sunday morning when my parents announced they were going to church and asked if we'd like to come along. Eric politely declined, saying we had errands to run, plus Mia had a play date. My father pressed the issue, saying it would do Mia good to be in God's house, that she needed spiritual guidance to avoid the sins I had once fallen into. Eric told him, more firmly this time, that we'd raise Mia the way we saw fit. My father lost his temper. He stood up towering over Eric and said, "You're dooming that child to a life of godlessness." That was enough for Eric. He looked at me, fury in his eyes, and then looked back at my father and said, "You have no right. You lost that right when you kicked your daughter out 5 years ago." My mother tried to calm my father, but he was seething. I stepped between them, telling my father he was out of line, that the arrangement we'd made required respect. If he couldn't stop pushing his beliefs onto us, then he needed to find somewhere else to stay. My father glared at me, that old rage back on his face. "You'd throw us out. Just like that?" he demanded. "After everything we've done for you?" I felt a surge of indignation. "Everything you've done for me?" I shouted. "You disowned me when I was pregnant, turned your back on your grandchild for years. We took you in even though you never apologized, and you're still trying to control our lives?" My father sputtered, eyes flaring, as though he'd never been spoken to that way by his own daughter. Then he stormed out the door, slamming it behind him. My mother trailed after him, limping on her cane, tears on her cheeks. Eric and I slumped onto the couch, exhausted, adrenaline coursing through us. Mia, startled by the shouting, ran in from her room. We reassured her everything was okay, that Grandma and Grandpa just needed some fresh air. But inside, I was seething, furious that my father still believed he had the moral high ground. That evening, my parents returned, looking chastened. My mother apologized for my father's outburst, saying he was upset and worried about their future. My father, arms crossed, muttered a half-hearted apology, though it was laced with references to my lifestyle. I told them plainly that if they wanted to remain living here, they had to accept that Eric and I would raise Mia with our own values. I wasn't opposed to letting her learn about religion, but on our terms, not theirs. My father looked ready to argue, but my mother squeezed his arm, and he stayed silent. Over the next few months, we fell into a strained routine. My father begrudgingly applied for government assistance, though he complained about it constantly. My mother helped around the house when her knee would allow. Eric and I continued working, juggling shifts and childcare, now with the added stress of 2 more mouths to feed. Occasionally, my parents would mention the possibility of moving out as soon as they found a stable income, but those possibilities never materialized quickly enough. The tension ebbed and flowed. Some days, it felt almost normal. My mother would cook dinner, we'd eat together, and Mia would show them her drawings. Other days, the old resentments flared, with my father making snide comments about my choices or Eric's lack of church attendance. A subtle shift occurred in my mother, though. She started paying more genuine attention to Mia, asking about her favorite games, offering to brush her hair. Once I walked into the living room and found my mother teaching Mia a simple sewing project, just some threading of fabric squares, but Mia was entranced. They both looked up, smiling. My mother gave a small tentative smile to me too, as if to see, I'm trying. I stood there a moment, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions, gratitude, cautious hope, and lingering hurt. My father took longer to thaw, but one day, Mia approached him with a picture she'd drawn, a family portrait. It showed me, Eric, Mia, and 2 older figures labeled Grandma and Grandpa. She'd drawn us all holding hands. My father stared at the drawing, his eyes misty, though he blinked it away quickly. He told Mia it was very nice. She beamed at him. Later, I found him sitting quietly in the corner, the picture in his hands, a troubled expression on his face. He didn't say anything when he saw me looking, just cleared his throat and set the picture aside. Eventually, the bank foreclosure on my parents' house finalized, and they realized they had nowhere else to go. My father finally swallowed his pride enough to accept a part-time job at a local hardware store. My mother started making crafts at home, knitting, sewing, and selling them online. It wasn't much, but it helped pay for their share of groceries. We were still crowded, but at least we could see some progress toward them standing on their own feet. As Mia's 5th birthday approached, I decided to throw her a small party. I invited a few of her preschool friends, plus some neighbors who had kids around the same age. I hesitated about including my parents. Would they overshadow the celebration with their judgments? But I remembered how excited my mother was whenever Mia mentioned a birthday, so I relented. We decorated the living room with balloons and streamers, set out cupcakes, and played children's music. The kids ran around giggling, playing pin the tail on the donkey. Eric manned the music. My parents stayed in the background at first, but eventually my mother helped me organize the snacks, and my father even tried to tie a balloon for one of the kids. Mia loved it. She blew out her candles while everyone cheered. For a brief moment, I felt like this was how family was supposed to be together, celebrating life. After the guests left, we cleaned up the mess of paper plates and wrapping paper. Mia was exhausted, happily counting her new toys. My father surprised me by asking if he could hold one of her gifts, a small doll. He looked it over, then turned to Mia and said, "Grandpa wants to see how your new friend looks." Mia proudly showed it off, talking about how she'd name it Lucy. My father nodded, a tiny smile tugging at his lips. Then he set the doll down and told Mia it was time for bed. She pouted, but let me tuck her in. My mother said goodnight, pressing a gentle kiss to Mia's forehead. I lingered at the bedroom doorway, heart aching at how different this was from my own childhood. It was simultaneously comforting and tragic. Later that night, I found my father sitting in the dimly lit living room, staring out the window. I approached him cautiously. "Everything okay?" I asked. He sighed heavily. "I'm just thinking," he replied. I waited, unsure if I should leave or stay. Finally, he continued, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I never thought I'd end up like this," he said. "Losing my home, living off my daughter's generosity." I sat down on the far end of the couch, giving him space. "Life doesn't always go how we plan," I said softly. He let out a mirthless chuckle. "You can say that again." We were silent a few moments, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Then he turned to me, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "I let my anger and pride drive you away. I was so focused on what the church thought, on what God supposedly wanted, that I forgot to be your father." Tears pricked my eyes. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I needed you," I whispered. "I was scared and alone, and you—" I trailed off, not wanting to stir up old resentments, but unable to avoid the truth. He bowed his head. "I know, I failed you." Silence again. Then he added, "Mia, she's a beautiful girl. I see how happy she is. You've done well." My chest tightened. "Eric's been a rock," I said, "and we've had help from others, but I won't lie, it's been hard." My father gazed at the floor. "I wish I could change it," he said simply. In that moment, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, sadness, relief, longing. I wanted to yell at him, to remind him of every tear I'd shed because of his judgment, but I also wanted to hold on to this fragile olive branch he was offering. So I just placed a tentative hand on his arm. "All we can do is move forward," I said. He nodded, eyes glistening in the dim light. It didn't fix everything. My father was still stubborn, still prone to letting his religious beliefs color his every opinion. But that night marked a shift, a softening, where he recognized he'd wronged me. My mother, too, became more open about her regret. She'd sit with me, watching Mia color, and say things like, "I wish I could have been there when she was born. I wish I could have helped you." I'd nod, tears in my own eyes, acknowledging the raw truth of it all. They stayed with us for about a year in total. During that time, my father eventually secured a slightly better paying job, and my mother's craft business online picked up a bit. We managed to keep the peace for the most part. Occasional arguments flared up, but we navigated them with cautious empathy. Mia grew closer to her grandparents, though she sometimes asked why they'd never visited before. I struggled to find the right words to explain it to her, finally settling on something like, "Grandma and Grandpa were away, but now they're here." When they finally saved enough to move into a small rental house a few miles away, it was both a relief and a bittersweet parting. We helped them pack up their corner of the living room, loading a few boxes and suitcases into Eric's old car. My mother hugged me tightly, tears running down her cheeks, thanking me for everything. My father, stoic as ever, shook Eric's hand and gave me a brief but warm hug, whispering "thank you" in my ear. Mia waved goodbye, not fully understanding that they wouldn't be living with us anymore. They settled into their rental, a modest one-story place that had enough room for them to be comfortable. We visited them occasionally, bringing Mia by so she could show them her new drawings or recite a song she learned in school. They, in turn, tried to be less judgmental, asking about Eric's job, inquiring about my college classes with genuine interest rather than condescension. Over time, we formed a version of the family bond I'd once dreamed of. Imperfect, a little strained, but real. My parents still went to their church, but they seemed to have learned that they couldn't impose their beliefs on me or Eric. Occasionally, my mother would invite us to a Christmas service, or my father would mention a sermon he found meaningful, but they didn't push it when we said no. And I began to realize that while they might never fully let go of their religious convictions or the mindset that once led them to exile me, they were at least trying to make amends in their own awkward way. Looking back, I still feel the sting of those early days, the heartbreak of being kicked out, the lonely nights, the bitterness of realizing my parents placed their religious image above my well-being. I can't magically erase that pain, but I also see how my life might have gone if I'd let anger consume me. I could have turned them away, could have said, "Go find some other place to live, you're not welcome here." Maybe they would have ended up on the streets, or maybe they'd have found a different relative to burden. But I would have lost any chance of closure or reconciliation. By opening my door to them, as reluctant and painful as it was, I gave us all a second chance. Not a perfect one. Some wounds never fully heal, but enough of a chance to see each other's humanity, to find moments of genuine warmth where once there was only judgment. In the end, I chose compassion, partly because I remembered how it felt to be desperate, and partly because I wanted Mia to see a different example. I wanted her to know that family can change, that love can persist, even when broken by betrayal. Now, years later, Mia is older, well into elementary school, a bright, spunky kid who loves to read and paint. She talks about her grandparents fondly, looks forward to their visits, and even invites them to her school events. My parents, though still devout, have softened around the edges. They've never explicitly said we were wrong to banish you, but their actions speak louder these days. They show up to Mia's recitals, bring small gifts, and sometimes even apologize for missing out on milestones. I'm not naive. I know they still hold beliefs that clash with my worldview. I know a part of them might still think Eric and I should be more devout, or that our marriage only recently made our relationship proper. But they've stopped voicing it, at least in front of Mia. And maybe that's all I can ask for, a willingness to keep the peace, to let love overshadow dogma. Sometimes, when I tuck Mia into bed at night, she'll ask questions about when she was a baby, why her grandparents weren't around back then. I try to keep it simple. They were dealing with some difficult feelings, and it took them time to figure out what really mattered. She'll nod, yawning, not fully understanding. But I think one day she will, and I hope she'll see that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means moving forward in spite of the hurt. It means choosing to create a future that's bigger than the past. And so that's how my very religious parents, who once kicked me out for being pregnant, ended up moving in with me years later, hoping to become active grandparents. It wasn't an easy road. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation, but it was real, and it meant that people can surprise you, even if they never fully atone for the wounds they inflicted. In my life now, I focus on what I can control. Being the best mother I can be to Mia, supporting Eric, and forging a healthier bond with my parents than I ever thought possible. And if that bond is still a bit fractured, maybe the cracks in it remind us of where we've been and how far we've come.